Okay. Bonjour à tous. Welcome to everybody for this April CANCEPT Meet&Share session. I propose that I give you one additional minute before we start to this meeting. And I start with apologize of Pauline Ostric, who is absent this week. So I take it over, and this was a little bit the last minute taking over. So we are, from my side, it's the first time I do the webinar on the Teams version. And so apologize for any technical problems in advance. So today we have the great pleasure to welcome Felix Norton from the English University in Norwich. And he will present us the digital application for prevention interventions. And Felix Norton is a professor of health psychology in the School of Health Sciences at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And he is also a registered health psychologist. His main research focus is on developing and evaluating digital intervention, and he will share this with us today. And the field of application is mainly smoking cessation interventions. He is also particularly interested in innovative technology-mediated approaches to change behavior, and in particular approaches which are just-in-time adaptive interventions, and he will tell us what it is exactly, and also learning about individual differences through the N out of 1 experimental and observational studies. And personally, I wasn't aware that there's N out of 1 also in prevention. I know that from the more the molecular sciences. So maybe we have time to exchange on this also. So as usually, we will start with a very rapid recall of the goals of CANCEPT, and I will share my screen for this. I also recall that you can ask questions in the questions and answers section, and we will then try to respond, or in particular Felix will be invited to respond to these questions. So I tried to share my screen, didn't work. Here it is. Yeah, this one. I think I have a technical problem. Did you see the slides? Because I have a turning point.
We saw your screen, but not the slides.
Okay. And now?
Yes,
do you see the slide? Okay,
the slides,
great.
Yeah.
So very briefly, to put everybody on the screen regarding the context of this CANCEPT Meet&Share webinar. So CANCEPT is a national research network to investigate innovative intervention in primary cancer prevention. This network gathers 6 teams. And definitively, I have a problem. Oh, passing my slides. Here it is. Gathers 7 teams from all over France working in the field of cancer prevention and cancer prevention research. The network is labeled and funded by the National Cancer Institute. And the aims of this network is to overcome fragmentation in primary cancer prevention by bringing on the table the stakeholders involved, field expertise, and expertise in research from renowned researchers, internationally renowned researchers, by developing approaches which are grounded in the cross-disciplinary approaches from the different participating. S'il vous plaît, pouvez-vous couper les micros, vos micros? Merci. Est-ce que vous pouvez couper vos micros, s'il vous plaît?
Je comme c'est la première fois, je vais
So, the overall goal of CANCEPT is to overcome fragmentation in primary cancer prevention. And we want to achieve this through involving the key stakeholders in the identification, design and implementation and evaluation of prevention interventions through participatory approaches. By better understanding the complex interaction of individual behavior and the environment of the individuals, both through the living environment and exposures, and how this can be integrated into prevention interventions. And third, to create synergies between the different components of cancer prevention, primary cancer prevention, and in particular between the community-based approaches and targeted prevention interventions dedicated to people at increased risk. And in this way, we want to transform also the way we produce and translate current knowledge into effective and sustainable cancer prevention strategies, and the transfer and sharing of knowledge in the field of prevention with the stakeholders and actors involved is particularly important. Does not move anymore. Okay, I think these are the main messages for CANCEPT for today. And the network both has working groups to deepen our understanding of the different challenges, and also replies to call for proposals to jointly set up research projects. And the CANCEPT Meet&Share are part of the activities in CANCEPT to share with the wider communities the methodological approaches and up-to-date expertise and of high scientific excellence in the field of cancer prevention. So, Felix Norton, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours, and I invite you to share your slides.
Fantastic.
Pendant que Félix partage les slides, je rappelle que le séminaire est enregistré et que vous pouvez, comme d'habitude, le suivre sur le canal YouTube de CANCEPT pour ceux qui ont besoin de le réécouter ou veulent le réécouter, ou pour ceux qui n'ont pas pu se connecter. Félix, le floor is yours.
Thank you, merci, and bonjour. So thank you very much, Beatrice, for that introduction, and to Pauline for the invitation and the CANCEPT network. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today about digital innovations, and this is something I've been very interested in for a long time, and have built a research program on. Most of the behaviours, the health behaviours that I'm interested in are those that are related to causing or preventing cancer, and so it's really a great opportunity to share some of the work and things that I've learned along the way with you today. I just wanted to start just as a reminder. I think everyone here will know there's a very strong link between certain behaviours and cancer, But just to sort of refresh our minds, this is some data from France. It's a little bit old now, but I don't think the picture would have changed very much in the meantime, showing that when looking at lifestyle environmental factors that cause cancer, we see that the sort of top four are those that are directly related to behaviours, particularly smoking, alcohol, and dietary behaviour. And so when we try to change these, it's important to consider behavioural science tools and frameworks to better understand what causes behaviour, but also what we can do to change these behaviours. So what I thought I would do was just to share some of the key principles that I've learned along the way when it comes to preventing cancer-related behaviours or changing cancer-related behaviours, particularly for digital approaches, but most of these work for any behaviour change. I appreciate that these may be obvious to some, but perhaps less obvious to other people. So bear with me if some of this feels like it's kind of obvious to you and things you already know. I'm going to talk about the importance of targeting the determinants or the influences of behaviour rather than trying to directly target behaviour. I'll just mention briefly about the importance of distinguishing between the initiation of behaviour change versus the maintenance of that. I think that's something that's often neglected in behaviour change in general. I'm also going to mention a little bit, and this connects what Beatrice was saying about N of 1 research that is definitely possible in the behavioural science field and cancer prevention in general, but just highlighting the importance about how different people are and what that means when we come to trying to intervene and change behaviour. And then finally, and this is specific to digital, but not exclusively so, that actually, when we're talking about changing behavior, we're really talking about changing 3 behaviors. And I'll explain what I mean by that when I get to it. So first of all, thinking about determinants of or influences behavior, it's very important to be sort of specific about what and to learn about what the factors are that influence behavior that we can change. So things that are modifiable. And this is obviously where existing models and frameworks can be useful. I have here an example of one of those. It's called the COM-B model. Has become quite popular, particularly in the UK, but is getting international recognition and use. It's a very high level model, and it indicates that behavior is determined by the interaction between 3 main influences. One of those is capability, and that's people's psychological capability, things like knowledge and skills to an extent, but also their physical capability, which might relate to skills as well. Their motivation, which is a common determinant, and this might relate to people's reflective motivation, their intentions or their goals that they're consciously and reflectively aware of. But it also includes automatic motivation, and these might be people's likes, drives, urges, but also aversions to things as well. And finally, opportunity, and that could relate to the social opportunity people have. So the social environment, the presence of other people and what those other people think an individual should do, but also the physical environment as well, and that could be money, resources, but also where you live and the kind of environment that you live in. So let's just take alcohol behavior for a moment. If we're wanting to reduce alcohol behavior, then we might be interested in changing people's knowledge or their psychological capability to make that kind of change. We might also be interested in how we can keep people motivated to make those changes. That might be reducing the perceived benefits of drinking, for example. And we may also, and this is an important one for drinking, we may want to try to help the person adapt their social environment, because drinking is often a social behavior, and so the social environment is or opportunity is very important. The key point I'm making here is that, and again, this is probably obvious to most of you, but we would intervene on these factors, these determinants, with an intervention, rather than try to directly target alcohol. So just telling people to reduce their drinking or to stop drinking isn't effective. Whereas actually, if we can target the factors which might be barriers towards them doing that, or may facilitate them changing their behavior, those are the things our interventions should be targeting. Okay, so the second point was this initiation versus maintenance, or not necessarily versus maintenance, but thinking about behavior as essentially a kind of two-step process. A question that's important is thinking about what factors are important for initiating a change in behavior, and considering that these aren't always the same as what factors are important for helping someone to maintain that behavior or that change. And I'll give you an example from some of our research. Some of the work we do is looking at smoking in pregnancy, and people quitting smoking in pregnancy. And this is work that's led by my colleague Joe Emery. We were interested to know what were the predictors of pregnant people quitting, starting a quit attempt. So that is defined as someone who makes a quit attempt of at least 24 hours. And we found that people, not surprisingly, people who are more motivated or had an intention to quit, a strong intention to quit, people who could see themselves as a non-smoker, people who had beliefs, particularly strong beliefs, that smoking in pregnancy was harmful, particularly for their unborn fetus, and they felt confident and they had higher levels of self-efficacy that they could quit, they were more likely to make a quit attempt than people who had lower levels of these. But interestingly, among those who then did make that a quit attempt, when we looked at what predicted their success in quitting throughout pregnancy, there was only one factor which came up. So people's motivation, their beliefs, those factors didn't seem to be important. What was important, though, is how their strength of dependence to nicotine or tobacco. So, as indicated by things like their cravings to smoke when they're abstinent. This was the only predictive factor for maintaining abstinence. So, if you were developing an intervention, then you might want to think about, how you start people with a quit attempt, and they might target the factors on the left. But then when you're trying to help them maintain that, you might want to think about, nicotine dependence as a key thing to support, and that could be addressed through things like nicotine replacement therapy, or medications, although not in pregnancy. The third point I wanted to make, or principle to highlight, was this point about people being different. And this really does sound very like common sense and obvious, and it kind of is and kind of isn't. So here we've got an example from a study that we did called Traject, where we were interested in following people, and this is an N of 1 study actually, Beatrice. We were following individuals over 90 days, so over 3 months, and we were interested to know how their behavior changed with respect to their use of an e-cigarette and tobacco. So these were people who were using both at baseline, called dual users, and here we've got their behavior from a sort of continuum of harm. At the top we've got tobacco, then dual tobacco and e-cigarette use, and then exclusive e-cigarette or vaping use, and then abstinence at the bottom. And you can see here, if you look at, say, the middle person on the top row, participant 2, you've got movement across the whole spectrum here, and it varies quite considerably by day. Whereas if you look at participant 3, you've got a much more stable process here. So this participant 3 almost always just dual uses. They rarely do anything else. And equally with the other participants, you can see that there's some trend over time as well. So there might be more movement at first, and then that stabilizes over a bit of time. So if you're again thinking about an intervention, then you would probably think about different things for these different patterns of behavior. Equally, we also find that what predicts people's movements from these different behaviors are also different between people. And we might use, again, I'm using this example of the COM-B model on the top right, but we might use models like this to learn what the factors are that predict these kinds of behaviors and how that differs from different people. And what we found is that people do differ on what predicts their behavior, but to such an extent where sometimes the same predictor can work in opposite directions for different people. So really understanding what predicts people's behavior is likely to be important. And so in some cases, one size fits all interventions are probably going to be inadequate, certainly when it comes to behavioural interventions for what many people need. This is obviously why many of our interventions are tailored, where we customise and adapt support based on information that we get from them. Usually that's sort of more basic information, but sometimes that could even be information on what predicts an individual's behaviour, and that's something we've been working towards in some of our research. And I will talk a bit shortly about how we might tailor support to real-time events, often referred to as just-in-time adaptive interventions, as Beatrice said at the beginning. So quick question for you relating to my final principle. How many interventions does it take to change behaviour using a digital intervention? It sounds a bit like a change a light bulb joke. It's not. And the answer is at least 2, probably 3. And this relates to it's particularly relevant for digital interventions to change behaviour. But it applies to any kind of intervention, really. And that is, we've got the uptake of the intervention, and let's just use apps, the most commonly used digital support for individual treatment, that is. So people installing an app, that would represent uptake, people engaging with the app sufficiently so that they can get some benefit from it. It's not just something they look at and then, on day one and then put down. And then finally, that they actually translate that engagement into some change in their behavior in some way. It kind of enacts into the real world. And often interventions are predominantly focused on number 3, and that makes a lot of sense. But if we ignore 1 and 2, then we could find we have a great intervention, but no one uses it. So it's really important that we consider each of these behaviours when we come to promote an intervention for cancer prevention or any kind of certainly behaviour change. And just taking these in turn, uptake is quite a challenging thing to influence, partly because if we're thinking about sort of real world uptake of apps, any kind of apps, the main way in which people get apps is on app stores, and we have 2 main app stores. And what happens is people might search for an app or a type of app or a behavior change that they're interested in, and the order in which the apps come up are, apart from adverts which come up at the top, are based on display rank, and that's based on the rating of the app, combined mainly with the number of downloads and whether there been a recent spike in downloads in particular. And that's, people rarely go beyond the first page of hits, so they generally choose something on that first page. And this could cause a bit of a problem for a couple of reasons. We've done some work led by Dorothy Sinai, who's looked at what attributes of an app are most likely to drive people's uptake of it. And this was specific to smoking cessation, but I dare say this would apply to many different kinds of behavior change apps and other kinds of apps. And what we found from this study was that it was a high star rating, which was the most important factor. Again, maybe that would chimes with your own experience, certainly does with mine, and such that, you know, a 4.8 rated app was around twice as likely to be selected as a 4.0 app. And in turn, a 4.0 app is about twice as likely as a 3.5 rated app. And that's with all these other factors held constant. So you might say, well, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is we just don't know if the ratings of apps correlate with how effective they are. So the most, and this is specific to smoking cessation apps again, but I think we'll find similar things in other areas. But the most highly rated smoking cessation apps, on average, have very poor guidance, adherence to clinical guidance. So they're not adhering to best practice. And furthermore, most of them don't have any supportive evidence at all. Although a little bit of a dated study now, this Huskins et al. Found only 2 out of the top 50 smoking cessation apps had any supportive evidence. And even then, the supportive evidence varied a lot. That hopefully has improved a bit, but I don't think it will have improved a great deal. So so it could be that people like apps because they're nice to use, but they're not actually helping them to change their behavior. And this is something we just don't know enough about. So that could compromise how digital interventions can actually help people to change their behavior and prevent cancer. There are some options to help with this. One option would be to create some sort of a curated app portal, and there are examples of this around. This would be kind of a bit like having your own app store, but having thresholds for how good an app is in terms of how well it meets evidence standards, or that there is some evidence of effectiveness, and other kinds of, other sorts of thresholds as well. And there are some nice examples of this. For example, in Germany, they have DiGA, the digital health apps directory, where there's a list of prescribable apps that health professionals can prescribe directly to patients, and that's covered through sort of healthcare costs. But thinking about smoking cessation, there's only currently 2 smoking cessation apps on that directory, suggesting there's not a huge amount of choice there for both clinicians choosing them and patients opting for different kinds of apps. So there's still work to be done. I think the mHealth Hub, that's WHO and others initiative, is quite a good place and highlights where there are some of these portals, but they do come and go quite a lot. In the UK, our NHS apps library had about 3 restarts before it was decommissioned, as it's quite challenging to maintain these portals for various reasons. You can promote uptake directly and independently from a particular intervention. And there's a nice example here from a colleague of mine, Zani Karjasari, who has found that using electronic patient records and text messages directly to patients through this to promote NHS apps. And in this study, they looked at a smoke-free NHS app and a drink reduction, alcohol reduction app. And they sent these basic text messages to people and found that actually of about 1,500 people who were sent one, around 14% of those clicked on the link to go further to actually look at the app. The study didn't go as far as finding out how many installed the app, and that's something that is being focused on a kind of large follow-up study that Zani's leading, that a few of us are involved in, really looking at e-signposting, which is how this is described. So how we can use electronic or digital approaches to promote either further digital interventions or also non-digital approaches, but through this kind of route. And then thinking about engagement, what we know from data from app stores, this is on the left, we've got some data from a very large number of Android app installs and how many people are still using those apps 30 days later after they install them. You can see here that in the health and fitness category, we've only got around 3% of people who are still using a health and fitness app 30 days after they install it. And actually, if you look at the number of people simply who use it on day 2, so the next day after they install it, we've got you down to about 20% immediately. So you get a very high attrition rate, sometimes dubbed as the engagement crisis. But I think often people window shop for apps and they download them and have a look at them. So there may be lots of reasons why you do get this high attrition rate, but it's an important issue. There's also an opportunity here, though, is to target engagement behaviours and to understand what the determinants of engagement as a behaviour and target those with an independent intervention. And that's something we do with our digital interventions. We think about how to promote engagement and what we need to do to maximise that, as a lot of interventions would. Okay, so I've finished this key principles section. There are no doubt lots of other key principles, but these are some that I've learned and found quite helpful along the way. What I'm going to do is just give an example of a project where we have hopefully considered these 4 key principles and some others to target, in this case, it's a smoking cessation problem. And the problem is that when people quit smoking or try to quit smoking, a lot of the reasons for why they end up having lapses, as in they smoke during the quit attempt, are due to cravings that are brought about by smoking cues from the environment. So we might have a trigger or a cue from the environment which brings on a craving, and then people struggle to address that craving. And at the moment, we don't have any behavioural interventions that can effectively target these. Telling people ahead of time, try these things out, doesn't tend to work very well. And the most commonly used medications, nicotine replacement therapy and nicotine patches, aren't effective in helping to resolve to resolve these kinds of cravings. They don't help. They help with other kinds of cravings, but not these cue-induced cravings. So what we've done is we've developed a in-the-moment intervention, which is adapted to the type of smoking cues that people are exposed to and the real-time likelihood of them experiencing them. And this is, as Beatrice said at the beginning, this is what we'd call a just-in-time adaptive intervention. So I won't go in any detail, but just to highlight, we've got a whole set of determinants that we've outlined, and these are the factors which we're targeting in our intervention. And what we've done is how the app works is there's a stage 1 where people would train the app, and after setting a quit date, they're asked to report every time they smoke, and they're asked a number of questions on those cues or triggers for that particular moment, that particular time. And what happens is the app, as well as collecting that data, collects location data on where they are smoking, their location at that time, and combines a sort of picture of the different smoking locations where that person smokes and what the likely triggers are for them. And this is part of an initiation of behaviour change stage, such that when their quit date arrives, the app monitors their location, and when they enter into one of these locations, which is denoted by what's called a geofence, a virtual perimeter around that area, that triggers the delivery of support. And that support is adapted to what are the cues or triggers for that person in that location. And it helps them to learn about how to manage those cues or avoid those cues at the same time. There are also features that help to promote engagement and help them with learning about their behaviour, but I won't talk about those at this point. And there's some additional support because people, if you co-design these things, people will ask for other kinds of support as well. And then the third stage of the app, after a 4-week quitting challenge, which was the stage 2, is about maintaining that change, and that's very much focused on maintenance. It reduces these in the moment support messages, and it's all around people developing their own strategies and skills to manage the cues and triggers that they might experience in the moment. So I'll just briefly finally mention our feasibility randomized control trial that we did. This was an interesting design of trial, I thought, because we fully automated the whole trial design, from recruitment to allocation and to the delivery of intervention, all the way to follow up. And the only manual bit we did was when people didn't respond to automatic prompts for follow up, and when we had to post out a saliva sample test kit to verify abstinence for those that had reported quitting smoking. And people were either randomized to usual care, which is the provision of the NHS smoke-free digital support, or the QuitSense arm, who received that same link to the NHS resources, but also a text message with a link and a code for installing the QuitSense app. And we followed them up at 2 time points. So in terms of uptake and engagement, we found that 75% installed the app, and interestingly, they did that very quickly, and a prompt from us after 3 days if they hadn't installed the app, for those that didn't make or almost made no difference to whether we could nudge people further. So they either installed it or they didn't. And then in terms of engagement, we found that around half of those kept on using the app beyond the quit date. And for them, their median duration was around 27 days. So actually, compared to that 3.4% I mentioned earlier, we had a much higher level of engagement, although you would expect that in a research study compared to sort of real world conditions. Certainly, that was above our expectations for the level of engagement we got from people. In terms of the behaviour impact, we had quite a difficult sort of definition of abstinence for people to meet. They had to have been abstinent for a whole 6-month period, and they were verified using saliva cotinine. And if we had missing data, we assumed they were a smoker. And we did find a sort of slightly higher than expected difference between our arms, a difference of around 9%. The study wasn't powered to detect differences between groups. And so that was slightly surprising that we found an effect, but there was problems with the saliva sample return rate among those people who reported abstinence, and there was a bit of imbalance between arms, so that could have created some bias in there, although it's hard to determine what might have caused that imbalance. If we remove the saliva sample aspect, then we see a similar between difference, so absolute difference between arms of 9%, but a smaller relative difference between the arms, and that was no longer statistically significant, but I would say closer to what the kinds of effect we would expect with this kind of intervention. We also found that people responded quickly to geofence messages, so these messages sent in real time, and the median response time was about 5 minutes after it was delivered to people, and actually that was faster than their response to more scheduled messages that the app delivered when we compared them, which was closer to 30 minutes on average of looking at them. So I'm at the end, really. I just wanted to highlight a couple of points. One is that there's some interesting work looking at how we might passively monitor smoking behaviour during a quit attempt. And there's a team at the University of Bristol led by Chris Stone and Andy Skinner that have looked and developed at a gesture recognition bit of software that can work on a smartwatch to literally detect the act of smoking and differentiate that between things like drinking and eating and other kinds of behaviours. And this is a way of perhaps capturing some of the missing data that we have when people don't always report every time they smoke, which can be important. So I think there's some really interesting options there. And just highlighting a couple of reviews, some of which we've been involved in and some which others, showing that this is quite embryonic, this just-in-time adaptive intervention still across different behaviours, substance use, physical activity, and there's a general review at the bottom there. Some indications that these interventions are feasible and acceptable to people, and some early indications that they might be effective, but we really need larger trials in this area. So I'm going to end there, but just wanted to thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Felix, for this important, very pertinent and very didactic presentation with a recall of the Combi model and the different dimension and what is needed in ingredients to change behavior. So for the moment, we don't have questions. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. I have quite a lot, but it's for you to the opportunity to change with Felix. And if you prefer asking questions in French, I should be available to translate them to Felix without problem. Maybe by waiting the questions to appear, I had a few questions. First of all, in addition to the didactic presentation of the different dimensions of the Combi model, I think something you highlighted very nicely is the temporal component in behavior change. And this is very often not integrated. It's sort of linear process, and not that you have probably, or as you've shown, other capacities to mobilize, to initiate behavior, than to maintain behavior. And even if everybody would say, well, of course, I agree with that, I think it's still in practice not integrated of time being an explicit dimension in behavior change interventions. I had two questions. The first is when you showed the attrition in the those who download apps. Do you have any information what is a part of actually the app itself that disappears? Our experience, we were very, very excited using apps with the CANCEPT patients in prevention and in particular for physical activity. And we launched 3 randomized trials using apps, and all of them disappeared. Luckily, the first ones before we started, and one within the trial, and we were very lucky that the hospital integrated the apps into the devices proposed. So I think this is another fragility, but would be interested to have your expertise on this.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. I think that you've highlighted a really challenging issue, and I would say not only apps disappearing, but also changes to operating systems that then require updates to even apps that might have been developed in-house, suddenly can result in an app not working halfway through a trial. So you're right, the fragility of digital technology, when there's any reliance on any external technology company, is a major risk factor, I think, for these kinds of interventions. And we've certainly experienced that ourselves in studies. Quite a lot of our research has also looked at simpler technologies like text messaging and other kinds of messaging approaches. And sometimes there are, I think, good reasons why simpler technologies can be more effective. You don't get so much of a problem with the uptake issue, for example, with a lot of messaging approaches, because people already have the software and built into phones that receive them. There's nothing you need them to do, and they seem like a very stable platform for delivering, support to, and you don't have the problems with companies going bust, or big tech companies changing aspects of their apps or their operating system platforms. And I think just as another example, the work that I referred to by colleagues at the University of Bristol in the UK with wearables, they've also had similar issues where wearables become no longer available, and they've calibrated their software for use of a particular type or particular device, and then that device becomes no longer accessible or no longer supported. So yeah, it is a real challenge, and I've spoken to many people who have the same things. So I guess ways around it are trying to have only as advanced as you need them to be interventions, and sometimes simpler ones can work as well, if not better. And then just trying to mitigate against major changes, and keep your ears to the ground in terms of some of those changes. Sometimes but not always, people are aware of those changes coming in. But yeah, I agree. I think this is a major challenge in this area.
Thank you, Felix. And there are quite a few questions coming up. The first one is from Quan Gan, asking, have you considered, Felix, adding multi-language support to the KidSense app so that it can better be used by potential collaborators?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually something we have been thinking about, and it's now something that's very easy to do, particularly with artificial intelligence translation services, which seem to be pretty good. We have been looking collaboratively at funding in non-UK countries where other languages are used. So that's something that's on the horizon. We are also doing a project with a commercial app provider called Smoke Free, which is oriented around smoking and pregnancy. And they've already got a sort of within their platform the ability to translate all of the content into lots of different languages, as their app is something that's been delivered worldwide. And I understand that it can be very, very, quick and easy to do that quick translation. What I think is perhaps a little trickier is culturally adapting support, particularly when a lot of it is, sort of behavioral support where there's lots of words and so on used, then expressions and, the way in which support is provided and things focused on can vary quite a lot between even cultures which feel quite similar. I'd say, across Europe, there'll be, you'd write messages differently, and that might make an app made in one language seem quite clunky in another. So I think there's an element of also having some rewriting going on there. But yeah, it's a good point, and something that we're certainly interested in doing.
Yeah, I think this is, and you're right, it's language translation, but also cultural translation, and you may need some cultural translation even within the same language. Two questions from Lucie Véron from Gustave Roussy, asking if there are any experimentation like KidSense, but for alcohol cessation. And the second one by Lucie is if, well, it's maybe a separate question. It's on the gamification. If you investigated gamification as also potential or pertinent intervention to engage the people.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And thanks, Lucy, for those great questions. So in terms of the first one, apps or interventions like QuitSense, but for alcohol, in the review I didn't really talk about, but was on the slide briefly near the end, which was looking at substance use disorders. There were some alcohol based interventions which would be classed as a just-in-time adaptive intervention, or at least based on the definition we used in that review. What there's a lack of is just-in-time adaptive interventions that are what we'd call passively triggered. So where if you think about QuitSense as I described it, the triggering of support was based on location, and that's passive because the person themselves aren't involved in the process of triggering that. That's the app. Whereas most just-in-time adaptive interventions are actually trigger the support based on people's response to quick surveys. So often an app might deliver an ecological momentary assessment or an EMA survey, and then it asks you about the kinds of questions that I explained QuitSense asks, but more in the moment. And then if people say, yes, I'm very stressed, yes, I'm having a bad day and I'm around all these other smokers and I've got strong cravings, then it uses that information to trigger the support. But that would be what we'd call an active just-in-time adaptive intervention, because the person has to be engaged in that. And if someone's already started to disengage, then there's a risk that that support can't be delivered. And I think that's what we're lacking. And we're lacking that in alcohol. There was an attempt by the in the UK, the alcohol industry had a drink aware app, which was using something similar like geofencing. I don't know how effective that was. I know there were perhaps some issues with that. Maybe that was just with an early version, but they did use a bit of the geofencing as well. So I think we'll see a lot more of this happening. But there's a bigger question here as well, which is what should we then deliver to people? If we know they're at a high risk time, we don't have enough science to really learn about what kind of messaging different people need at that moment, what's going to be powerful enough to shift someone away from reaching out for the drink or the cigarette or the snack or whatever it might be, versus it not doing any difference. So yeah, more work needs to be done on that. And in terms of gamification, yeah, thanks for raising that. Totally agree. It is can be a powerful way of engaging people with apps. It would often drive that. If you remember, I brought up the COM-B model when talking about engagement, and that would be targeting motivational factors. And I think that's a really common and good way of keeping people using the app. I think where the evidence is less clear as to how important gamification is for actually changing the ultimate behavior. And I think it's much, much weaker for that. So it's good for getting people to use the app. And I think that's currently looking like its best use. Whether gamification on its own is enough to help people change their behavior, I think that's less clear. So yeah, thanks for that point. I totally agree.
Okay, for the moment, no other question from the audience. I had an additional question, which is regarding to the use of the N out of 1 clinical trials, which is, of course, something very appealing. And actually, in the field of psychology, I think but it has been named N out of 1 by Gordon Guyot from Hamilton University when he developed this with the purpose of developing and testing intervention in a randomized way for clinical situations where there is a lot of heterogeneity in the clinical presentation and in the response of treatment. So, but I think this has been used earlier in the psychology field of psychology. This was not familiar with this. And of course, this seems to make sense because you have nicely highlighted the heterogeneity with the little pictures of the people in their quitting smoking process. There is a major challenge in prevention intervention, which is the transferability and scaling up, and where we have actually to face the heterogeneity of the context where you tested an intervention, and yet then to assess the transferability to another question, and then to scale up. And I'm not expert with the N out of 1 trial, but to have a specific setting to respond to the heterogeneity of the individual, with having later in mind to having something which can be applied not only to a group of patients in a very controlled setting, but with the aim ultimately to apply this in population approaches, or at least in high risk individual, which means much more different context, much less standardized context, and much more heterogeneous context. Could you, what would be very interesting to hear you on this in question.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you're right. I think N of one randomized controlled trials. We've done some of these for in a number of different sort of areas of focus. They can act very well as demonstrating proof of concept for interventions. They enable, of course, for people to be their own controls, so they eliminate a lot of the confounding that sometimes plagues smaller randomized controlled trials or observational studies. And I think they're useful for giving an idea about to what extent interventions, the effect of interventions may vary between people. In terms of scaling up, I think there are some interesting machine learning, which comes under the umbrella of artificial intelligence approaches that kind of do a similar job to what you're trying to learn about in an N of one RCT, but does this in a much more real world context. So, for example, you could use one interesting approach would be reinforcement learning, which is, as I'm sure many of us know, is an approach where a system or an app or whatever can learn about things that it's delivered to people that is actually helping versus things it delivers that doesn't result in a change in behavior or whatever the outcome is it's looking at, and it can adapt and do more of the things that seem to be working and less of the things that aren't working for that individual. And I think there's some really interesting examples where this has been, it's been tested. One challenge with that is that you need a lot of data to create a model for each individual, and this is difficult and often, if it relies on people completing self-report for the same reason as you gave, Beatrice, you don't tend to get, it's not very scalable because most people in the real world aren't happy to complete surveys 5 times a day for 4 weeks in order to train a model. But there are some shortcuts I think that can be made. For example, using aggregated data for a while and then moving over to individual level data when there's enough data there. So I think there's some really interesting innovations which kind of are like self-learning systems which can learn about the individual. We still lack good examples of where that's really been really effective, but I think this is definitely an area we'll see more activity from.
Thank you. Very thoughtful response. And if you have any publications, would be interesting to in deep this. We have time for last question. Is again, thank you, Lucy, for your questions to Felix, which asked about the nudges and in which way the nudges differ from gamification in terms of digital intervention. And what are your thoughts about that, Felix?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Also, another really good question. So, nudges are generally related to sort of environmental interventions. That could be digital environment or the physical environment. So, for example, in the digital environment, that could be, say, if you were checking out in a online shopping. If you're doing your grocery shopping online, it might then come up with some nudges about recommendations for alternative or healthier options for some of your less healthy things you have in your basket. So I think that works quite well, and it's often delivered at a sort of environmental basis rather than for an individual. I think in terms of individual nudges, that would probably come more under the sorts of prompts and support messages that you might get in the kinds of individual level interventions I was mentioning. So I think combining the two would be great. So if there's nudges in the environment combined with personalized support for that individual, I think you're gonna hopefully have an additive or synergistic effect between those two. But yeah, I think that's definitely one we need to learn a bit more about in terms of the digital environment.
Thank you very much, Felix, for this very nice orientation also, and shows up also that there's still a lot to do and to be investigated in terms of research, and probably combining different intervention is also a perspective to be additionally investigated. So we are at the end of our CANCEPT Meet and Share session from this month of April. And I thank you really much, Felix, for this nice intervention. To everybody again, we will share this on YouTube so you can hear it again. And have a nice day. And Felix would be happy to keep in touch. And thank you very much again. Bye-bye to everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.